Welcome to our latest edition of Lunch With. And today we're going to be having lunch with Charlie Weinberg of SafeGround. Hello, Charlie.
Hi.
Lovely, thank you for joining us. Charlie's been the Executive Director of SafeGround since 2010 rather, and has a significant experience of work in youth work and community arts activist, and indeed in TV script writing, and we'll come on to that in due course. Those who've been attended these programs in the past know the format. We have a sort of an informal conversation covering a range of issues, really, both current work, but also it's always very interesting to explore the trajectory of our guests and kind of get them to talk a little bit about how their career and lives have kind of developed over a period of time. We have the Q&A function, which you can access via the app. So if there's a question you'd like to pose to Charlie, or in just a general reflection on what she's saying, then do use that function and we'll try to introduce those questions during the course of the conversation. It's a fairly relaxed conversation, so if kind of right towards the end you suddenly think about something that Charlie said in the first 5 minutes and you want to kind of follow it up, that's fine. We can kind of move backwards and forwards as we go. Let's make a start. So Charlie, you, as I said, you've been the Executive Director at SafeGround since 2010. I suppose I should just mention that you also, SafeGround is based in the same building as the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, so we know each other well, and indeed we've talked on many occasions and indeed argued on some occasions as well. So we have a kind of creative and interesting partnership there. And you're also the Chair of Trustees of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. So we should just get all of those kinds of declarations of interest, as it were, out of the window at the beginning. So yeah, but tell us a little bit about the work of SafeGround, a bit about kind of where it started from and how it currently operates.
Sure, thank you. And I would start by saying I kind of want to say something about we're in the same building. I am the chair of CCJS and I'm the director of SafeGround. That seems very incestuous. It is all absolutely kosher and above board. And if there are any questions about that, let's take them. But thanks for laying it out. We moved into the office in about 2017, I think, having spent about 6 years saying we couldn't afford it. So SafeGround was set up in about 1995 by two friends, Antonia Rubinstein and Holly Freeman, who were studying, I think, applied theatre, and started around Antonia's kitchen table to design and deliver arts-based kind of workshops in their local community, which was Wandsworth. And they ran a choir and they did some puppetry workshops, and they were, I think, quite engaged and, did quite a few successful projects. And then Antonia became increasingly conscious of and distressed by the levels of self-inflicted death and self-harm at what was then Glenparva Young Offenders Institution, and got SafeGround into Glenparva to deliver some drama workshops, which apparently went really well. Antonia was critical of their success and thought perhaps these young men were grateful for some attention, perhaps saw Antonia and Polly as kind of maternal figures, wanted to kind of test the hypothesis that this was effective and high functioning process using drama in a custodial setting, and somehow got herself into, with SafeGround, HMP Wandsworth to kind of trial drama workshops with adult men in prison, which, they weren't the first person ever to have done that, but I think at that time, 95, 96, it wasn't the most common occurrence. And apparently it went really well. The men were kind of really intrigued and impressed and moved by the process of using drama to kind of rehearse their experiences and suggested to Antonia and Polly that this could be a useful tool for those men in thinking about how to, as the legend goes, kind of divert their own children, particularly their sons, from following in their footsteps.
And there's a, just on Wandsworth, you mentioned to me the other day, there's a kind of an interesting artifact, maybe, which we were the West. Just tell us briefly about that. So I don't want to cut in, but well, I'm cutting in. What am I saying? I'm cutting in. Do tell us a little bit just about that plaque. So
sure. So many years ago, on a visit to the prison, because we used to run our programs. Oh, so you're jumping ahead. Let me tell the story in a way that follows. I will get to the bronze plaque, but so at that time when Antonio had run the first workshop in Wano, the social exclusion unit, I think published, it was about maybe 2008, published a report that kind of discovered that, lo and behold, family relationships were really important to what wasn't then called desistance, but I suppose was called reduced reoffending. And so the Home Office, which was the body then, it was pre-MOJ, it was the Home Office that controlled the budget for the prison service, invited Safe Ground, I mean, how this happened, I have no idea, but invited Safe Ground to devise what was then and pretty much still is the only ever arts-based family relationships programme for men in the UK prison system. So between 1998, and 2010, Safe Ground concentrated and totally focused all its resource and energies on the development of what became Family Man and Fathers Inside, which are two of the best evidenced group work programmes currently available around family relationships. Years ago, when I was in Wandsworth, someone showed me a bronze plaque on the floor at the back of the jail that says Safe Ground on it. And they must have been taking the mickey out of me, because at the time when it was a member of staff, obviously, but they showed it to me and said, that means that when there's a riot, if you stand on that plaque, nobody can touch you. It's a safe place. And I kind of went, okay, that makes sense. Anyway, just last week, we went into Wano for the first time in ages, and I mentioned this to a new member of staff that I hadn't met before and asked him about it, and he took us to see it because my colleague hadn't seen it and said he doesn't know what it's for, or what it's about, or why it's there. But there it is, it says Safe Ground on it. So if anybody does know, I'd love to know what that is about. Is it about us, or is it something else? Or is it actually that it's a safe place to stand in the middle of when it's all going, I don't know.
And is it literally, the word is simply Safe Ground, that's it?
Yeah. It's just a bronze circle, size of a side plate.
All right. Well, that's really fascinating. Well, anybody watching, or indeed watching now or on the recording later, would love to know, and I'm sure Charlie would love to know.
Wandsworth do have a museum, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he came to our 21st birthday, and I am going to ask him because, yeah, fun fact for the website. Yeah. So anyway, so Family Man and Father Inside were kind of developed and evolved with men in Wandsworth and other prisons nationally over a kind of 10-year period, until they became quite a well-known, well-established, well-researched resource running. In 2010, when I arrived at Safe Ground, Family Man and Fathers Inside, that's what Safe Ground did. And they were running probably in about 10 prisons nationally. Each prison probably running 4 programmes a year. And wherever possible, Safe Ground would try and raise separate funding to deliver kind of community arts programmes to complement the work that it was doing in custody. Polly had left the organisation by then, and Antonia stood down after 15 years as founder, and I was the first appointed director, which for me was a big thing. I was a practitioner, I didn't know what I was doing, but I'd applied for the job because, having read the job description, I thought I could do it. So yeah, I took it over, and 12 years on, here we are. But the organisation has changed significantly, obviously, in that time. And I think what we have sustained and kind of developed that we inherited from that early period is an investment and a belief in the value of high quality evidence, a commitment to external analysis and research of our impact. What are we doing? Why? To what effect? And to whose agenda? And a kind of quality standard that means we have a consistently recognised reputation for, I'd like to say excellence, but it sounds really pompous. So I think we're known to be kind of good, and we deliver what we say we're going to deliver by and large, which is really important to the team and the board, obviously. And we remain small, although our kind of repertoire and services has developed significantly since those early days.
Okay, we're going to, towards the end of this discussion, we're going to come back to talking about some of those kinds of, current practice challenges and how an organisation like SafeGround, or, doing that kind of work can kind of, operate in what is quite a challenging environment. I mean, the idea that, oh, we just got some money to do this project in prison, not quite sure how that happened. I mean, doesn't quite happen in the same way now, but we'll come back to that towards the end of this program. But before we do that, let's kind of scroll back and start, talk about sort of a bit about your career trajectory, or your kind of life trajectory, because it's quite an interesting one. You started kind of work as a youth worker in Leicester, I think, and then kind of and that itself was a kind of, I think, quite a formative period in your life. So just tell us a little bit about, kind of where it all started and how you got involved in that whole kind of area of work.
Sure. So yeah, I went to college in Leicester. I went to Leicester Polytechnic as it was when I started, De Montfort University as it was when I finished, much to my chagrin. But while I was there, I worked in a jeans shop, and I worked downstairs in the fitting room doing the alterations. And there would be loads of young women coming in and out of the fitting rooms going, oh, I look fat, look at this, my bum looks big. And I would be kind of talking them through their jean selection and getting them to talk to each other. And my friend Asif suggested to me, as a result of that I go and volunteer at the youth club that he worked at, in a kind of a large estate just on the outside border of the city centre that I'd never been to before. And it was on a Sunday, and it kind of meant 2 buses, and I really thought, oh my God. But at the time I was a bit kind of down and could do with something to fill my Sundays after a heartbreak. So I said, all right. So I turned up with I'm a poet. And in those days I was quite prolific. And I thought, poetry, it's going to be like the Dead Poets Society. This is so exciting. This is my big moment. So I packed my barrel bag of poetry books and Jim Jordan and Audre Lorde and God knows what, went off to Beaumont Leys and arrived to find a group of young men come standing around the outside of walls playing pool, and just thought, oh God, I've so pitched this wrong. This is not going to work. Anyway, I put my name up on the pool board and it got wiped off. So I put my name back up on the pool board and it got wiped off. That went on about 6 times until somebody, whose name I remember, in the end just said, oh, let her play, man, just let her play pool. And I was in, that was it, I was a youth worker, and those young men, I worked there volunteering for about 3 or 4 years. And during that period of time, tell me if I'm going on too long, sorry, I don't know how, I don't even know if this is interesting, but so I was a volunteer youth worker there. Simultaneous to that, I had a good friend who was volunteering at what was called at the time Special Needs Youth Club in another part of the city. And that youth club was called the Highfields Integrated Youth Association, the premise being that it integrated young people with special education and learning needs with mainstream children that were at mainstream education. But of course, there were no children at mainstream education in that youth club. So very early on, I became very kind of aware and conscious of the ways in which kind of discriminatory and selective practices were at play. And in the integrated youth club, the youngest member of that group at the time, we're talking about a very long time ago, we're talking about 1992, but at that time the youngest member of the group was 9, a 9-year-old girl, and the oldest member of that group was about 24. They were older than me. So I don't think in any other circumstance you would get a 9-year-old and a 24-year-old in the same recreational youth work group. So I was very quickly kind of confronted with a lot of ideas and practices around small p political agendas and motivations and awarenesses that. So I became a volunteer youth worker. I loved youth work. It was very political for me. And lo and behold, I really enjoyed it. I'd like to say I was really good at it. I was really good at sticking to it. And I did a lot of youth work across Leicester City. And in lots of different I did detached youth work, I did hostel-based youth work, I did drug-based youth work, I did all sorts of different youth work. And then I got really fed up with the political climate and the policies around young people's engagement, and so called it a day really and tried to find something else. Not something else from youth work, but a different environment to deliver my practice in.
Before we get on to that, there's a couple of questions here from sort of Malcolm, which is kind of similar theme really. One is about our instilling hope and a refusal to judge the essence of what you're striving to do. And we might want to come back to that in relation to Safe Ground later. And kind of related, is just turning up 90% of life. You're kind of that really interesting. I mean, you were kind of a young woman walking into a youth club where your name kept being wiped off the board. And actually, there's something quite symbolic about that, actually, I suspect, and kind of having the kind of temerity, perhaps, or the courage, or the conviction, or the sheer bloody mindedness to just say, I'm putting my name back up. I'm turning up. I don't care what you do. You're not, going to intimidate me. I mean, is that kind of an important feature?
I think it's really interesting, actually, because there were 2 other youth workers in that hut at the time. It was an old porter cabin, both male. One was the manager, who had quite a senior job, and the other was just your kind of bog standard youth worker. And one was nowhere to be seen, and the other one was with his back to the young men, reading The Sun. So there's turning up and there's turning up. And I think, and the last bit of the question, I guess, is kind of something about, I think it's still a question that I have today about my style or my approach or is it temerity, is it persistence, is it bloody mindedness, is it aggression, is it kind of a power balance and a struggle between female staff and male participants? What is that dynamic, and why did I do that? I mean, I had just taken 2 buses on a Sunday afternoon to get there, and was I really up for public humiliation in front of a bunch of strangers? But I'm sure there are much more gentle, subtle, calm ways to do that. I happen to take that, and I think there is something, I continue to reflect on my own practice and stance in those situations, and for good or for bad, I don't know if they've changed much. I'd like to say they've developed and they're much more complex and sophisticated, but I think it's a really pertinent question and a really valid point. I think turning up with intent and clarity and a really clear understanding of your own agenda and drivers and position and power and location in the system might well be 90% of life. I don't know, I don't really understand that phrase, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Because it's sort of, I mean, again, going back to that formative experience, really, I mean, and the difference between turning up and turning up, I'm pretty sure that had I been in the same situation as you, I would have been standing on the outside and just watching and thinking, what do I do here? So it took a degree of chutzpah to kind of, turn up and kind of announce yourself by putting your name on the board. I mean, kind of in a sense, an old youth worker's trick from a very young and inexperienced person at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know what a youth club was really. I've never been a member of a youth club. I've never, as a young person, I didn't go to the youth club. And I had no training at that time. So I guess it was just, and bearing in mind, I was 19, 20. Some of those young men were the same age as me. So to an extent, it was kind of a peer-to-peer power play as well, But it never occurred to me that someone's going to have to tell me what is going on at least. So I guess I had to kind of force that to happen, and that's what I did. And
you mentioned there were a lot of young men there. And you mentioned a 9-year-old. I don't know if we actually said whether it was a boy or a girl.
A different situation.
Okay. But were the youth work, was it mostly young men? Was it a mixed group? Was there there must have been some interesting dynamics.
When I asked about that, the manager said, because of the location of the porter cabin at the back of the sports centre and the fact that there wasn't any street lights in there, that's why girls didn't attend that youth club, and that was just the way it was. So, but to his credit, that youth work manager also put me on the Leicester City Council youth work training, certificated training course. Me, Asif and another colleague from Leicester City got put on our youth work training course. And that, I had to do a project. And so I undertook some outreach and started to work with the boys about the idea of bringing girls into the club and making it a true youth club rather than a boys club, which happened over a period of time. And
it wasn't just the street lights.
Well, I mean,
I'm sure that was a factor. But, yeah.
I think. And it was those young women, 2 young women, that I first met when I was doing my outreach and trying to think about how do girls want to come to this youth club, that eventually won a Sony Music Award, very long story, and took me to get my nose pierced. They held me in the chair while I got my nose pierced. That was their present to me when they won a small grant to buy microphones for their band.
But tell us a bit about the Sony Music Award then. What was...
When I met them, they were the sisters, and they were drawing fashion designs for their band, and they wanted help and advice. And so one thing led to another. We ended up with a band which had some of the young men from the club with these 2 young women and one of their friends. And they eventually, there was a young man on the other side of town who very tragically took a fall during a football match, and unbeknownst to anyone, his neck was broken, but the ambulance took so long to arrive, and someone trying to help moved him, and he died. And that was a huge community kind of event. And I asked the band if they wanted to play his memorial concert, which they did. And as a result of that, they applied for a Sony Music Award. It was like £500 or something. You had to fill in a massive form. Anyway, they won it. And they bought themselves some microphones with stands and some bits and pieces. And they took me to get my nose pierced.
As a kind of a thank you.
What is this? If anyone is still listening, apologies. Ask some sensible questions.
Let's you kind of indicated that you reached a point that however kind of interesting and challenging and rewarding it was, you were kind of up for a fresh challenge. And it's quite a big step what you chose to do, because you didn't just sort of leave those particular roles, or indeed Leicester. You left the country and went somewhere else. So you ended up in Nicaragua. Well, hardly ended up. I mean, you chose to go there. So I think you've already explained, maybe in a sense, what prompted you to go. What drew you to Nicaragua, though? I mean, of all the places that you could have gone to.
I think I was really disillusioned with the political environment in which I was trying to do youth work. It was the late 90s, 98, 99. Lots of things were changing, and the kind of policy agenda for young people wasn't really very exciting or progressive in my mind. And I wanted to understand and experience what it might be like to be in kind of philosophically revolutionary environments. I used to, occasionally, I would read the Voice newspaper, and I happened to be flicking through it one day. I had just started Spanish lessons. I'd been to one with my friend, and the tutor said, "Why do you want to learn Spanish?" And I said, "Well, I don't always see myself living in the UK, and I think it's a beautiful language." Lo and behold, I'm flicking through the paper, and there's a very small advert that says, "Wanted youth worker, Nicaragua, feminist organisation." Give that a go. I'm a youth worker. Feminist is interesting. Don't know anything about Nicaragua, but why not apply? Anyway, very long story short, obviously I got the job. Oh my God. I really wasn't expecting that, if I'm honest. I kind of thought I'd do it to tick it off and get rid of it as an option, and then got a 2-year contract. So that was that. I held
So you jumped on the plane, didn't really speak Spanish or had a smattering of it?
I mean, it's really embarrassing. And when I got there, all of this became an issue because, you know, years later, for different reasons, I did come to understand that the whole development model, to my mind, is flawed and upside down. But at the time, I didn't know what development work was. I'm a youth worker. I didn't know. I've never really thought about or understood the dynamics of development agencies. I didn't know it was a thing. So a non-Spanish speaking European heritage Englishwoman turns up at one of the foremost feminist Nicaraguan kind of radical girls and women's organisations in the north of Nicaragua, when they had explicitly selected a different candidate who wasn't me. I didn't know any of this at the time, but for very good reason. They had wanted someone who could speak Spanish, drive, was Latin American at least, and had some understanding or experience of some of the issues that some of the girls and women they were dealing with might have had, which, you know, isn't unreasonable. But A, I was totally blind to them with that, embarrassingly enough, and B, wasn't what they got. So that was tricky, and you know, I cringe about it now, and there are so many things that I wish I'd known and done differently. But after 6 months, they suggested that maybe they'd be better off without me, and the thought of failing, I'd given up the tenancy of my flat. I had literally given away everything I owned. I had 400 records, they'd all gone. All my clothes had gone. I'd literally, all my furniture I'd given. And people were coming around to my flat in minivans and kind of taking some, my dishwasher, my washing machine, my fridge, everything went. I had nothing. I had nothing. And so the thought of kind of being summarily dismissed from Central America with a suitcase wasn't appealing. And by another very long story that, you know, fascinating to me, probably not to anyone else, lo and behold, I got interviewed for a job in the sister organisation to that feminist organisation in the north, in the capital city. Puntos de Encuentro interviewed me to work with the director, the executive director of the organisation, on what was to be the second series of their award-winning soap opera, although I don't think it had won any awards then, their social soap opera, Sexless in Finland. And I wasn't a scriptwriter, but I was the kind of story coordinator, and I worked with the scriptwriters to make sure that all the scripts and stories were problematizing and critiquing all the various analysis and viewpoints of all the civil society organisations that we were working with nationally and regionally.
Just to hold it for a moment there. So you went to Nicaragua, and rather like turning up in that youth club some years earlier and having your name erased from the board, after 6 months, they kind of erased you again. And rather than kind of running away with your tail between your legs, as it were, and turning up back in the UK, you thought you kind of, as it were, wrote your name back. I'm extending the metaphor a bit at this point, but you wrote your name back up on the board in a rather interesting way and ended up working on a soap opera, which is kind of, I imagine that when you left Leicester, a year earlier, or, that wasn't quite what you were expecting to happen. It was quite an interesting.
I mean, it does beg the question, is there something I'm ignoring in this pattern that maybe I should, maybe I should accept the fact that people don't want me around? That's another way to look at it, because funnily enough, and this hadn't occurred to me until you said that, but I didn't really get a credit on the soap opera. I worked on it for 5 years, and the credits were always a bit of a contentious issue. So, I mean, interesting, lots of interpretations. But yeah, I guess I was always very clear about my agenda, my values, my intention, my purpose, and what I saw my kind of skills and contributions to be. And I was always quite tenacious in finding a way to do that, I guess. I mean, that sounds very clear, but I don't mean it like that. I don't think it was never conscious, but that's not true either. So yeah, I kind of those didn't feel like my terms.
So tell us a little bit about the soap opera, because it's sort of, I mean, it was a very significant soap opera in the context of Nicaragua, but maybe not kind of in a sort of a Neighbours, EastEnders way. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a soap opera fan myself.
So in Nicaragua at that time, Puntos was a feminist NGO that had been kind of established after when the Sandinistas took control of government, and they were very well known. They were a huge national resource working around women and young people's issues nationally and Central America wide. And the soap opera was the brainchild of one of the then directors. The social soap opera born out of the kind of well-established theory that a soap opera is a social education tool. That's how it emerged. The Archers is the longest running soap opera in the world, and it was born out of a need for the government to talk to the population about farming and agriculture and food and crops and kind of post-war requirements. And in South Africa, there'd been a really successful soap opera movement dealing with issues of HIV, stigma reduction, public awareness, health education, that then kind of developed to encompass issues around blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. And so this was a very evidence-based theoretical approach to public education around significant issues in Nicaragua, which the first series dealt with predominantly homophobia, illegal abortion, sexual and reproductive health rights, and domestic violence. And indeed, economic migration. Nicaragua has a huge issue of a 5 million population. I mean, 1 million people at that time were economic migrants sending money home, which was one of the biggest income streams of the country. It was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere at that time. So the soap opera was a kind of very radical in a thoroughly conservative, both small and capital C country, in an environment that was, had been suffered the throes of colonial imperialist rule over centuries, huge amounts of impoverishment through external policy and embezzlement, and not to mention, you know, earthquakes, floods, landslides. To be talking about issues like homophobia, domestic violence, and campaigning to change the law was not a small feat. And people used to say it's much less radical to be a Sandinista in Nicaragua at that time than it is to be a feminist. So the women who kind of set up and led that organisation were real kind of pioneers. And it was through that experience partly that I came very early on to think, this development model is twisted. I shouldn't be here. These Nicaraguan people should be in, in England teaching people. Well, I'm not teaching anybody anything. That was very obvious to me. So yeah, and I was there for 5 years.
And is that program still going now? Or, I mean,
so there have been huge political, social changes in Nicaragua, which people may or may not be aware of. And like many NGOs, Juntos has reorganized itself. I think it's shrunk massively, and it maintains a kind of campaigning and educational materials production function, I think. But they've sold their building. When I joined, there were 60 staff. You know, I think there's a very small group of core staff working with freelance associates now to kind of deliver probably very high impact services. But no, it's nothing like it used to be. The number of NGOs in Nicaragua currently is minuscule compared to what it used to be.
And is that a result of a sort of a lack of funding, political hostility, kind of a reactionary culture?
And all three of those things, all interrelated. And I think, you know, government priorities, agendas, and animosities often have direct impact on large, high-profile, non-governmental organisations, just as they do on other types of public and voluntary services. So there is lots of differing opinion and analysis about the current political situation in Nicaragua, just as I expect there is about the current political situation in the UK. You know, I have my own, and there are huge, huge changes that have occurred. That means that the work of Juntos is no longer what it was. But there are women trying really hard to continue.
So you came back to the UK around 2007, I think. You sold everything or given everything away. So you came back, I guess, more or less with, apart from a few kind of souvenirs and other bits and pieces you picked up on the, you know, you came back with not very much. And I mean, apart from extraordinary experiences and memories. So what did you come back to, as it were?
Well, yeah. I had always mocked people who used to talk about culture. What's it called? Culture. There's a phrase for, like, if you live in a different culture, like, you have to reintegrate. And I always used to think, oh, what a load of old baloney. You know, that's not a thing. And I think it probably is a bit of a thing. And so it took me a very long time to find my feet in the UK. People's lives move on, things are different. It's not easy to recalibrate your whole life. Anyway, not a sob story. I found it quite tricky, and I was very lucky to find somewhere to live, and then spent quite a long time trying to find gainful employment. I mean, that wasn't easy, not gonna lie. Hustled a little bit and eventually did find gainful employment back in my groove and got employed on a part-time maternity cover basis to develop what was at the time, I found out in my early desk research for the job, the only arts-based personal development programme for girls in custody in the UK. So I set to work on creating and delivering that, which I did. I had a 9-month contract. We delivered the programme once in entirety. It was 10 days. And very shortly after that, very sadly, my post was made redundant. However, that project was, again, that was the first time I'd ever worked in prison, 2009, in HMP Downview, in what was then the Josephine Butler unit, girls under 18. Yeah, so that was another kind of, I really enjoyed that piece of work. It was pretty formative for me as well.
And you also started a master's. There was a bit of kind of serendipity around that, involving a rather long and worthy film.
Yeah, so of memory, I had come from Nicaragua, where I'd wanted to understand kind of revolutionary environments, come back, and one day in my kind of unemployed phase, saw an advert for a film, a free film at Birkbeck. So I went along to see it, and on the door it said, "This film is 7 hours long." And I thought, well, that's obviously an error. But it wasn't. It was a 7-hour movie that had a break in the middle. But it was about the French Revolution.
How many people stayed after the break? How many people came back?
I mean, I have to admit to having a little snooze at one point, so I wasn't really paying attention. But I mean, it was a good turnout, and there was a Q&A afterwards. It was made with community members from that particular area of Paris who had studied a particular part of the revolution in that geographical location, had created characters based on those historical documents, and had made this film, which did eventually get aired at like 3 o'clock in the morning or something. So very few people see it. And there was a Q&A with the director afterwards. Peter Watkins, his name was. He's English but lives in France. And I asked a hugely interesting question. And after that event, there was wine and, you know, vol au vent or whatever it was. So I stayed for the wine, and the director of the MA, I think he was a director of MAs in films, approached me and asked me if I wanted to apply at Westminster University. So yeah, I ended up getting a place on an MA in art and media practice at Westminster and a job that would pay for it, all in the same month, after 2 years being unemployed, wondering what I was going to do with my life. So yeah, that was a stroke of luck. Right place, right time.
But kind of also maybe sort of making your own luck to a degree and kind of grabbing hold of,
well, I mean,
opportunities.
Yeah, influenced by lots of kind of factors, I guess. But yeah, it was great. I suggested both of them.
And so you then joined Safe Ground.
Yeah.
And you were the first director after, as it were, the founding director, which itself, it's always a bit of a exciting challenge when that happens. But you're sort of, I mean, Safe Ground, I guess, has inevitably evolved and changed quite a bit since you joined it. And it'd be kind of interesting maybe to just reflect on how the kind of operating environment has changed over the years. You mentioned, for example, Nicaragua, a number of, you know, organizations kind of gone to dust, as it were, as a result of, you know, adverse political and funding headwinds. And of course, that will be a familiar refrain in this country as well. So tell us a little bit what the kind of the main priorities that, you know, kind of Safe Ground are currently working on, and how you kind of work in what is a really challenging challenging climate, particularly if you're sort of, as it were, maybe slightly going against the grain of where political agendas are kind of going?
Okay, so main priorities of Safe Ground are, the big vision is towards a world without punishment. What are the conditions necessary whereby punishment as a initial and kind of fundamental response becomes less necessary or less natural, naturalized, normalized?
So kind of a small and rather kind of modest ambition, that one, yeah.
But I think it comes out of a long history and trajectory of working in punishing environments, within punishing regimes, not just the criminal justice system, but kind of lots of governance, line management, authoritarian structures whereby whose fault was it, who's to blame, who's the individual that we can kind of pinpoint for this error, who's the bad apple, you know, a lot of very punitive individualizing and individualized supposed resolutions to a lot of actually very systemic, very structural, clearly repeatable and patterns problems. So I guess it's as much a reaction to that as anything else. And the ways that we do that are by developing and devising, for want of a better word, products and services, processes that apply equally to people in prison, be they children, young adults, men or women, and staff, and family members or community members. And we work across those groups, ideally at the same time. And our programs are designed to consider that as the system within which change or understanding or movement happens, and that everybody has to have agency in that, be engaged in that, and be party to that process, which is often really uncomfortable, difficult, challenging, and dynamic.
And how important in your mind is the kind, I mean, obviously it's important because Safe Ground does this kind of work, sort of arts and, you know, kind of creative drama therapy. It's probably, that's my words, not yours necessarily. But how kind of, I mean, it feels like it's a very kind of under-explored area in the current prison system. You know, I mean, in a sense, there's not that many programs like Safe Ground around. Or is that because, you know, it's just not that important? Because the prison system doesn't really kind of recognize its value? I mean,
well, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, there's a whole organisation infrastructure body set up to protect and serve the arts organisations in the criminal justice system in the UK.
This is the Criminal Justice Arts Alliance.
Correct. Formerly known as the Arts Alliance.
Right.
So they have a huge evidence library, and they are tasked with kind of expounding, demonstrating, disseminating, and making very public the impact, value, rationale, successes, weaknesses, learnings of art practices throughout the criminal justice system. And they've been doing that for a very long time. So I don't think that either there isn't any or that it's not understood. I think there is a lot and it's absolutely understood. You know, I think to deliver high quality services is expensive. It costs money, and to achieve quality and impact and sustain that over a period of time is a huge investment of resource, of mentality, of commitment, of values, and of time. Well, in the women's estate, what's the average sentence that women will serve? 6 weeks? What's the point of making a huge investment in time and resource? And in the male estate, you know, sentences vary massively. Remand prisoners might be somewhere for 13 weeks. Well, what's the point of investing in them? and life sentence prisoners, or people serving more than 10 years, well, what's the point of arresting in there? So I'm guessing, and this is by no means a scientific analysis, but I guess if you're talking about making a huge commitment and you're talking about spending money on it, in my limited experience, there's often what would appear to be quite a cogent argument with a small p politically to suggest that arts in the criminal justice system isn't really a public spending priority, regardless of all the evidence and history and trajectory and promotion to suggest certainly a counter narrative, if not the opposite.
I mean, is there a kind of, there was a, a famous or infamous moment back in actually the coalition government some years ago where sort of the tabloids got a hold of a story about comedy kind of, yeah, which was banned
everybody.
And there was a kind of a sense then that, prisons are not really for this kind of fluffy creative stuff. They're kind of there for punishment, and they're there to kind of, it shouldn't be a nice experience. And something that kind of sounds like it's about kind of maybe bringing a bit of hope and a bit of, kind of creativity and colour to a rather grey life, as it were, is kind of...
Well, interesting. Is it about hope and colour, or is it about agency and self-awareness and really small p political analysis of yourself in a system that is individual, communal, social, global? Is there actually, it's not, I mean, there's lots of academic treatises about the importance of hope. Okay, great. I think that's probably not invaluable, not unvaluable. Of course, it's valuable to have hope, but I think hope is also born out of a sense of an understanding of your place in the world, your autonomy, your agency, your decision making, and your clarity of thought, your understanding of your own attitudes and values, your position taking on things, and your ability to think through complex, nuanced processes, dynamics, and relationships. So, to my mind, this is often the conversation, hope, and this is not to denigrate you, sorry, but I think I'm having a strong reaction to the idea that we go in and bring some hope and some colour. Actually, we go in and we ask people to think about who they are in relationship to who people think they are, who people want them to be, who they themselves have always tried, thought, wanted to be, Actually, it's about kind of constructing an inner world that is robust and resilient and owned enough to transition through the external world without totally collapsing or being in catastrophe and crisis, because there's a lot of catastrophe and crisis to cope with right now, as there is at any point in any human life. Does that make any sense? Is this all very abstract? I'm not giving any examples of being very clear or practical.
Let's just kind of pick up on one aspect, because one of the things that you've been doing more recently is working with Whitney Isles, one of our former lunch with guests, and with Katuna Sinsadze, who's going to be our lunch with guest in June. Very much looking forward to that one. But you've been working with them on writing some kind of think pieces for the centre on critical care series, and kind of, I suppose at the sort of heart of that is a kind of, as it were, a notion also of sort of anti-oppressive practice and what it means to kind of do some kind of transformative practice in maybe a kind of a practice environment which is almost makes it very difficult to do that. So what's that? I mean, just share a little bit about your kind of perspective on where you feel you are now with those whole issues around critical care and anti-oppressive practice.
I think Katuna, Whitney and I found I would describe very special and important bond around the incongruence often between the external appearance of things and the internal practices and protocols and processes of things, and how that can often be very uncomfortable. So, you know, the kind of external public narrative versus the internal dynamics and relationships. It happens in every, I guess, house, organisation, sector. It's not unique to us in any way, but I think Whitney Katuna and I have developed a really important, for me, relationship and capacity to kind of think through some of those discrepancies and discomforts and challenges. And the critical care series is a way of us sharing that and being transparent about what some of those challenges are. You know, is there a way to be critical about some of the assumptions and generalizations that often get made? I think the first one we wrote was originally called Trauma is Not a Fetish. You know, trauma is not a fashion. And how has trauma become everything and potentially nothing in that process? Why is everything now trauma and traumatized and traumatic? What does it actually mean? And how do we get back to an understanding of trauma as a really vital, imperative kind of technical term, as opposed to anything difficult that anyone has ever suffered or experienced? They're separate things. I think there was one about leadership and kind of the iconography of the individual leader and how useful is that and what does it mean, both internal to organisations but external to governance structures. What happens when we invest all our authority in a single person? Is that a good idea? Maybe it is, but maybe it's worth thinking about. You know, it's kind of these questions around what we're doing and why, and how do we feel about it.
And the more recently still the piece which has been quite popular on the website about the notion of performance activism, you know, the idea of voluntary organisations kind of, I suppose, overclaiming or kind of, you know, congratulating themselves for work well done, but actually in the real world nothing has really changed, and we're kind of caught in this kind of almost like a hamster on a wheel, just sort of going round and round and not moving anywhere, which is a kind of, I think, quite a challenging notion for, I mean, I think we, you know, also had a lot of kind of resonance, I think, with a number of the readers.
Yeah, I think it's a perennial issue, isn't it? On the one hand, if we're making so much difference, how come things are so much worse in some ways? And because some of the improvements that have happened probably don't have much to do with many of the voluntary sector organisations. Certainly, you know, I don't think SafeGround can lay claim to the reduction in the number of European heritage young men in prison, for example. I don't think they're related at all necessarily, although that has happened. So on the one hand, if we're so successful, how come there's not transformational change? And on the other hand, what is our, you know, I guess it's the perennial abolition versus reform debate / confusion / dynamic around what's your long-term vision? Do you want this system to be better? Do you want to reform what we've got so that it functions well and is clean and decent and safe? Or do you want to work towards the design, development, delivery, implementation, and continued evolution of a totally distinct system, which is, you know, colloquially framed as abolition, but I guess it's kind of deconstruction, reconstruction. It's a dialectic. It doesn't, there's no end destination to it. It's a movement away from what we have, which is flawed, which might maintain some of the functional bits of it. I don't know if party democracy is actually the best model. I don't know, but that's one of the things we probably need to think about. I don't know if housing people in closed institutions for their own safety is ultimately a useful and necessary idea. I don't know, but I think we need to be able to figure it out. But that requires taking away the model that we currently have. Thank
you, Charlie. We're out of time. These hours always go very quickly. So thank you so much for sharing a lot of, kind of really interesting and challenging thoughts, and indeed sharing your really very exciting, very kind of interesting sort of, life trajectory, really. And, still many years to go, of course. So, I mentioned earlier that that Charlie works with Whitney and Katuna Sinsadze on this critical care series, and I mentioned that Katuna will be joining us in a future edition of Lunch With. So that will be on the 22nd of June. Very much looking forward to that. And before that, on the 18th of May, we'll be having lunch with the policing scholar and activist Alex Vitale, who a few years ago wrote a book which became very popular during the context of the defund police movement, The End of Policing. So that's on the 18th of May. Alex will be joining us from New York. So let's make sure hope we get the time zones right. So, but for now, thank you, Charlie, for giving us lots to think about and reflect on. And I look forward to seeing, and thank you, obviously, those who attended today's session. I look forward to seeing you at a future edition of Lunch With. For now, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks.